series. Yes, this will be the third week dealing with, on the negative end, discrimination, and stating it positively, showing extreme favoritism to one group of people, and of course, negatively being discriminatory. And at this point, anytime you do an extended amount of time on one isolated topic, okay, we've been talking about going through James verse by verse, we've been dealing with discrimination. Now for the third week, sometimes there's a natural tendency to say, are we going a little bit overboard? I mean, haven't we sort of kicked the horse enough? Isn't there a lot of other topics we can move on to? But James spends half of this chapter 2, there's only 5 chapters. Half of this chapter is dealing with this topic of discrimination and favoritism within the church. And, part of our issues may be because we say, well, everybody does it. And that's true. Everybody does, to some degree, have people or group of people or others that they will tend to look down upon, other people that they will try to kiss up to and to make favor with. And we talked about how even it was common in church history. Remember that the first week we talked about there's been some dark episodes even throughout the history of church where they've been blatantly discriminatory. And it's still here today. It was back in James' day, obviously, and it's still here. Now I remember a story I heard about a fellow calling, just a very simple country man. He called up the church, and just in his country way, he said, the assistant answered the phone and said, I would like to speak to the head hog at the trough. That was, just his way. And the secretary was taken back. She said, excuse me? I would like to speak to the head hog at the trough. She said, well, if you are referring to the pastor, first of all, he is not in. And second of all, you need to refer to him with respect and dignity that he deserves. You may call him either the pastor or the reverend. And the fellow on the phone said, well, I see, ma'am, I wasn't trying to cause any trouble. I was just going to let him know that I sold my farm for $1 million and I'm ready to pay my tithe. Oh, I see. Well, I think the big pig is walking through the door right now. All right, you can probably see that happening. Suddenly, money talks, and we begin to change our way we treat people. And you know what? Sin is sin. And even though it's a common sin, even though it's something that every church, and really every person in the church has to deal with, it's something that can seem small and seem insignificant. It can ruin a church's testimony. It can hinder, I believe, the power of the church's witness, its ability to connect with the gospels, we said last week, where it is going the most. And that's the people who are being marginalized, the people who are obscured. Yesterday I was thinking about this. Me and a couple of other guys, Sam, we were putting up the bounce houses that you saw in the picture, big heavy bounce houses, and I was rolling it over, and all of a sudden I felt this sharp pain in my hand. And I had a little bit of dirt because we were rolling it around, and I looked at my hands and my arm, and a little piece of dirt was moving. And I was like, oh my, I flicked off a fire ant, okay? It was so small, I couldn't even tell that it was a fire ant. And you know how it just kind of lingers, the pain stings? Well, later that afternoon, my hand started to swell. It's still a little bit swollen right now, but it started to swell up. I got this big knot on my hand. And I'm thinking, here I am. I'm this full-grown, 175-pound man, and this little speck of an ant that couldn't even tell it was an ant at first. And I thought, how small is the mouth on that little ant to be able to get into my skin? And then I'm just overthinking this. I think, how much poison is in this ant to cause my hand to swell up? And so I started telling my wife. I was trying to get a little sympathy, I'm in pain and suffering. And so she goes, you ought to use that as an illustration. So that was appreciate that, Mindy. But, I thought about that. I thought about, that little something insignificant. And when the pain it can bring, the hindrance it can cause. And how, in this case, something that James deals with, something we need to deal with. So for the final week of this series, we're in James 2. Now, if you want to, while you're turning there, if you don't have a Bible, you can use the Pew Bible in front of you, page 1882, 1882. And let me walk you through the first 7 verses, because we've covered verses 1 to 7 up to this point. And basically, James is going to use a threefold argument. He's going to boom, boom, boom. He hit it 3 points. And the first one we saw in verses 1 through 4, James says, let me help you to understand. Discrimination is irreverent. And we said that really goes against the very nature and character of God. And what we have done when we are discriminating, when we are placing value judgments on someone that God has not placed, and we're elevating someone that is not worthy, deserving of an elevation, we have taken the glory that belongs to Jesus Christ, verse 1, and we put it on a man. We put it on someone who doesn't deserve the favor and the honor and above and beyond. And we've done that for bad and evil reasons. He said in verse 4, you've become evil by doing that. You're taking the place of God as judge. And we said that's irreverent. That's taking away something that belongs to God. In this case, His glory and His judgment. And then last week, we went into the second argument. And he said, James basically said in verses 5 through 7, that it is irrational. It doesn't even make sense with what you should know about the Bible. What you should know about the way God treats and relates to people, it doesn't make any sense at all that you would be discriminatory towards the poor, towards the marginalized, towards the rejected. He said it doesn't make sense. First of all, it doesn't make sense spiritually. Because the one thing we know all throughout the Bible is that God does not pick people based on what they deserve. God does not choose people because they're beautiful, because they're wealthy, because they're powerful, because they have a great personality. God chooses people for the exact opposite reason. They don't deserve it. That's what He's done throughout all of the Bible, throughout all of history. God chooses and puts His grace, His favor on people who don't deserve it. And He said, so instead, you're going to be unlike God, and you are going to put favor on someone based on what they can provide, because they have a little bit of money, because you relate to them as far as skin color and background. You're going to be discriminatory. It doesn't even make sense. It's not the way God works. Why would you work that way? And then we said last week, it doesn't make sense socially, because James was basically addressing a majority of the church that was poor. The church has always been a history of poor people. It was that way in James' day. It's been that way all throughout church history, and we used examples last week of how the church is comprised of the majority of people, middle class, lower, poor class throughout history. And that those of us who are wealthy, those of you who do have some means and have some financial resources, you are the rare ones. You are the blessed ones, because you have been accepted into the community of faith in spite of the distractions of riches. And so he said that doesn't even make sense. These people, they're going to oppress you. They want to send you to jail. They want to hinder your freedoms in Christ. And you're lifting them up like there's something special. He said it doesn't make sense. It's completely irrational. Now when we come to the third and final argument, and this is sort of the capstone summary of it all, we see number 3, that discrimination is inconsistent. Before we do that, let's look at verses 8 through 13. We'll read them together. We'll pick it up where we left off from last week in verse 8. If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. Speak and act, verse 12, as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. Because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. If you're following in your notes, if you want to follow along in your worship guide, and we'll see it here, number 3, discrimination is inconsistent. And it's really inconsistent. That's a great summary statement. But it's inconsistent with what it means to be a Christian. How you became a Christian, what it means to be a Christian, how a Christian should behave and act. That's what we're all going to see today, that it is completely and diametrically opposed to anything and everything it means to be a follower of Jesus. Now he breaks it down specifically, letter A. It is inconsistent with the greatest of commands. It's inconsistent with the greatest of commands. Look at verse 8 and 9 again. A couple of phrases there. The first thing we read is the royal law. Now you see that there. And different people, well, I wonder if it means this, I wonder if it means that. Basically, there's a couple of meanings there. It's a very subtle word in that it has a dual meaning. First, it means royal in that it came from the King of Kings. And so the people reading James, they were basically in a monarchy. Caesar was the emperor. So they understood what it meant for a law or a command to come straight from the king. It had the highest of priorities. And James is reminding them, as people who know Jesus, who've read accounts of Jesus, to know that one of the messages Jesus preached over and over again was that the greatest of